Hello and welcome to Epochs episode 53. I am here with Bo and we're going to be discussing the history of Formula One.
Yeah, well, I thought we could have a little bit of a palate cleanser. At least maybe once a year, once every 50 odd episodes. I thought we might do a topic that's a little bit less sort of intense.
Yeah, you honestly couldn't have picked a better one, at least for me to be a part of, because it is my favourite sport and probably my favourite hobby, like as in ever. It was the first sport that I started following and I've been addicted to it ever since.
Yeah, me too. I love racing. I love all racing, not just Formula One. I like almost anything, really. IndyCar, Indy Lights, NASCAR, anything, really. The other day I was watching some Japanese speedway mini moto.
Oh yeah,
I was gripped by it. So yeah, of course, Formula One. Absolutely love it. It's a big part of my childhood, even.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I was when I was younger, I was massively into football. Not so much, but as the years have gone by, I've become more and more enthralled by Formula One. And I know it's not everyone's cup of tea. I know a lot of people that actively don't like it. They think it's silly, if anything. But I think it's absolutely fascinating. And before anyone clicks off of this, because it's just not their thing, the angle I want to do here is a bit more, it's about the life and death of Formula One, not just the cars and the stats, but how incredibly dangerous it is.
Oh, yeah.
And how we're not really used to it anymore. It's very rare that someone dies, because there was Jules Bianchi not too long ago. And
that's 2014, 2015?
Is it that long ago?
2015?
Blimey, is it that long ago?
Yeah.
Seems like yesterday. And there was that poor kid in Formula 2.
Antoine Hubert.
Hubert died not too long ago. But it's very rare. I mean, both those were freak occurrences. You couldn't really have seen, well, Hubert's a bit different, but there were freak accidents. It's very rare that people die. Whereas back in the day, people died a lot. A lot. In the late 60s, early 70s, 1 in 7 drivers died every year, year on year.
God, 1 in 7.
Yeah. In the early 70s, when arguably it was its most dangerous, early to mid 70s, if you raced for 2 consecutive years, your likelihood of dying was over 60%.
Yeah.
Absolutely mad. And people burning to death live on TV.
That is the worst way to go, isn't it?
Multiple examples, and you can find it on YouTube, of people burning to death live on TV. People, all sorts of really quite disgusting things happened. And you don't get that with any other sport. There's nothing like it.
No.
And anyway, I thought we could chart the history of things, just chronologically, roughly.
Yeah, sounds great.
And see how it goes. But it was just one thing to say, you are an actual karter, competitive karter.
Yes, I am.
So
yes, I am.
You actually do know about finding the limits of grip and all that sort of thing.
I do, yes. Yeah, I know more about, I suppose, racing lines and race strategy than the technicalities of what's involved in karts, because I've only ever done rental kart racing, and what was it, Club 100 as well, which is a higher form of rental kart racing that you need a license for. It's now an MSV hosted event. But yeah, I absolutely love it. As soon as I started it up again when I was, 26, I haven't been able to get myself off it since. And I can't help but think that it brings me back to when I started watching Formula One age 6, or at least it's the closest thing I'm ever going to get to racing in Formula One, probably. We'll see. But yeah, I love it, and it's definitely intensified my the relationship I feel that I have with the sport.
Right, yeah. So is it Club 100?
Club 100.
So that's properly competitive karting. Like
Yes.
You raced alongside Jimmy Broadbent once, is that correct?
Yes, technically speaking, not in the same race, but in all of the 24-hour races at Buckmore Park, I have raced against him, and my greatest claim to fame actually is beating him in the 2020 24-hour race. As we beat them to the podium in the clubman class, and I had a kind of a proud but smug moment when Jimmy came to congratulate me, and I was like, bad luck. And he didn't get the joke, and I felt terrible afterwards. I'm really sorry, Jimmy, but it was great, and he absolutely thrashed us this year, sadly, but yeah, I loved it.
If anyone doesn't know, Jim Broadbent is a big YouTuber into racing and things, and he's good. He races Pragas now, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does, and he's
real,
doing really well.
He's not bad. He's not bad.
He's won a few races, hasn't he?
He's definitely won at least one, I've seen. I don't follow his career that closely, but I'm pretty sure he's won at least one, and he's absolutely competitive. There's no question about that. So I don't want to damn him with faint praise there. He's not bad.
Yeah.
So
I have heard that he's got a particularly competitive car
Oh, really?
compared to the others. Yes, so that might help, but
Okay.
I guess he's got the resources to fund it, hasn't he?
Yeah, probably. Well, yeah, his channel's pretty big.
Oh,
I mean,
it's huge.
I myself have been karting a few hundred times. Nothing competitive, but I've been karting loads, and I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
It's hard to describe how much I love it. It's like a small child at Christmas. It's
Yeah.
like you can't really
that
describe it. There's
feeling.
no words
Yeah.
of how much I just want to sit in a car and go fast.
There was a sense of almost coming home when I actually got in there and I put my foot on the accelerator, and it just sparks the passion again. Like you go back to being like mentally 8 years old, just like that. Just the feel of speed, the sound of the engine, and it's brilliant.
What I would love to do, I've heard people say that there's cars with extremely powerful engines, crazily powerful engines. Then there's cars that have got any sort of aero package, any downforce on them. Then there's cars that use sort of race slick tyres. And it's only when you get in something that's got all three of those that you can really understand. Of course, I've never been in any of those things. But only then can you really understand what it might be like for a Formula One driver, a modern Formula One driver, where the car just sticks. You can do crazy things with it. You can just go bang and turn in a 90-degree.
Yeah, I know this from personal experience. When I test drove, well, it wasn't officially a test drive; it was a track day. I'd had the pleasure of driving a Formula 4 car. It was restricted, unfortunately. So I couldn't really open it up in a way that a Formula 4 driver could. But when you're taught in a BMW M4 how to drive around the circuit, it's utterly pointless.
Right.
Because on the very first turn at Brands Hatch, you can go flat in any of the single-seater cars because of the downforce that it offers. And you try to do that in the BMW M4, you'll just lose the rear and slide off. Your brain is telling you when you approach that straight, like slam on the brakes. You cannot do that as a single-seater racing driver because you'll lose, potentially 2.5 seconds from doing that. You've just got to keep your foot on that accelerator. It doesn't feel natural at all. I gave it a go. What was it on my third attempt? I was like, oh my God, this feels wrong. It's like you're being on a roller coaster that you're controlling. It's so unnatural, but that's what makes it so sublime.
Yeah, and the idea of like lifting off where everyone else isn't, or using the brake where everyone else isn't, that's crazily dangerous.
Yeah.
Someone's just going to slam into the back of you. They're going 50 miles an hour faster than you or something.
Yeah, it's a real test of balls.
Yeah, I mean, even the amount of go-karting I've done, you get some high-speed corners where you can do it flat, and you have to work up to it, right? I mean, it's unnatural where there's effectively a wall right in front of you, and you're going flat out at it, and you have to. It is a funny feeling, I must admit. So I would love to. It's never going to happen for me now, but I'd love to have a go in something very, very light and powerful. But anyways, perhaps we should crack on with the actual the history of it. Because as people might be able to guess, we could both talk about this sort of thing till the cows come home.
Yeah.
I mean, literally hours and hours and hours I could talk about racing.
100%.
But if we're just going to do F1, because it's always sort of spoke of as sort of the pinnacle of racing.
Yeah.
Depends how you want to measure it. I suppose one of the first things to say is that fundamentally there's two different types of racing. There's stock car racing and sort of non-stock car racing. Famously, NASCAR is stock cars, so at least in theory they're all the same or very, very close. Whereas Formula One isn't that. It's never been that. It's here's a set of rules and turn up with whatever you can within those rules. And so you get cars that are, crazily different in performance. And that's just the way it's always been. I know I've spoken to some people, usually people that don't really know anything about racing. They say, well, that's crap then, isn't it? Because whoever's got the best car is going to win nearly always. And so how is that interesting? I just don't agree with that view.
No, neither do I. It makes it. Of course, there is value in the idea of having the same equipment, like in a karting race, for example, because then you can actually see the capabilities of the drivers and how they weigh up against each other. But a team sport like Formula One, where you are trying your best to bend the rules, if you like, adds a whole new dimension to it. Not only have you got the skill of the driver, you've got the skill of the driver trying to negotiate a car that the team is trying to negotiate in accordance with the rules that it's got. So you've got this extraordinary interplay where you've got teams testing the rules against other teams testing the rules, and then of course you've got the drivers competing within themselves, and the whole aesthetic experience of watching it is just that much more addictive, I find.
Yeah, I just love watching cars go at race speeds or at qualifying speeds. You can see a car once you've got your eye and once you've watched enough racing. You can see when someone's driving something in anger, can't you?
Oh, yes.
And when they're right on the raggedy edge of grip, right on the limit of what that machine and man can do.
Yeah.
I find that really, really interesting. I know some don't, but also like the romance of it. For example, a lot of people don't really like Monaco. I love it. I know the race is kind of boring.
It is a bit.
But I still love it. And the qualifying and, well, just all sorts of things. So let's get into it. The FIA Formula One World Championship, as it exists, formally started in 1950. That's when they count the races, because a year or two ago they had the 1,000th race.
That's right.
But of course, people were racing cars before 1950, weren't they? So I heard Bill Burr once talk about this about American football, or football as Americans call it. They're on I can't remember what number Super Bowl they're on, but again, like they just started it at a certain time. I think it was in the 60s. They said like this is Super Bowl one, but of course the people were playing American football long before that. Apparently, I think maybe the Bears. One team did really well in that era, and it's all sort of formally forgotten. It doesn't count. So anyway, Formula One started in 1950, but going back, people were racing cars as soon as you had horseless carriages.
Yeah.
Pretty much in the late 1860s, when the first sort of basically horseless carriages were around.
1860s?
Late 1860s. A couple of people tried to race something.
As you do.
Yeah, right, yeah. And back in those days, or let's say turn of the century, let's start there, sort of turn of the 20th century, cars were quite often built by companies that built coaches, like the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang style cars, you know, those sort of massive...
I'd love to see those racing.
Yeah. They do sort of... you get like Glorious Goodwood. Sometimes you get something from sort of 1905.
Yeah.
But it's very rare that any of them survive anymore. Certainly that work anymore. But those big old cars, and they were just massively heavy, skinny wheels, sort of no brakes to speak of.
Yeah.
Not no brakes, but to speak of. You know, just these crazy ancient drum brake things, and so people have been racing, but they were all sort of what they were called sort of gentlemen amateurs. At that time, you know, for a start, you'd have to be rich.
Yeah,
there's no question about that. You'd have to be quite rich, like Toad of Toad Hall. You know, it's for aristocrats, really, eccentric aristocrats. Because if you crash one, I mean, a normal person just could never afford to repair it or anything. No. So, but these guys, I mean, Mercedes were really big in sort of the 20s and 30s. They were sort of dominated it, really.
Yeah.
I've seen people say that in the 30s. Racing just was not competitive, because when Mercedes turned up, they were dominated by minutes. No one was really close, because apparently the Nazi Germany, literally Nazi Germany, the real Nazi Germany, pumped lots and lots of money into research and development. They saw it as sort of a point of national prestige to have the best race cars.
Yeah, so there's no way you can compete with that. Would you literally have an entire, country investing into the infrastructure of a sport that's not yet professionalised?
Yeah. Hitler literally... Hitler was actually a car enthusiast. In Hitler's Table Talk, which is a book which chronicles the things he used to talk about at dinner at Berchtesgaden, he quite often talked about cars and his drivers, and what his drivers think about the new Mercedes or the new Volkswagen or something. But so anyway, in the pre-war years, there was the Mercedes team boss, Alfred Neubauer, big fat man. If you know anything about pre-war racing, you can't avoid him. And he just dominated it, a bit like the modern era before this year. Mercedes, the Mercs, just it was just not competitive. But it was crazily dangerous. It wasn't quite as dangerous as it became in the late 60s, early 70s. It was crazily dangerous. You didn't have to wear... There was no safety, basically.
No seatbelts?
No seatbelts. Oh, they didn't make seatbelts mandatory until, I think... the 1980s, Jacques Villeneuve's father, was killed in a Ferrari and thrown clear of it, and it was like 1982. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt.
I would have expected it to have been a lot earlier than that. My word.
I think the FIA passed a rule in the late 70s, or maybe the early 70s, that you're supposed to have seatbelts, but it was still left to drivers' discretion. And so Gilles Villeneuve was one of those guys that was like, no, it doesn't feel right. I need to be able to move around a bit.
Yeah.
Well, it cost him his life. It cost him his life.
Yeah, he may argue that it was a worthy sacrifice, given that it allows you to get that extra tenth of a second. But then that depends on your philosophy, really. It's the freer you can move your body around, the faster, in theory, you can make the car go. Yeah.
Because of course now they're strapped in as tight as could be.
Oh God. Yeah.
But back in sort of the pre-war years, they thought very much like motorcycle races. Because I also love superbikes, MotoGP, the 500s in GP. MotoGP is brilliant. I love the 125s actually because you still get like 7 guys fighting for the last corner.
A
I love motorbikes.
Moto 3 bikes, are they 125s?
Sorry?
Moto 3 bikes, are they 125s?
I don't know about Moto 3.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
You've got MotoGP and they've got
Yeah.
125s, 250s and 500s. Of course, 500s is sort of the big show, isn't it? That's where Valentino Rossi and Marc Marquez and all that are in the 500s. But I like the smaller ones as well. Like the 125s, quite often you get loads of, they're just undercutting, overcutting each other, corner after corner after corner.
Last year, like Pedro Acosta, I think, who went on to win the championship, started from the pit lane in the first race and went on to win the race.
Wow.
How do you do that?
Yeah.
I mean, he literally lost like half of a lap and still won the race.
Incredible.
Unbelievable, yeah. So it's crazy down at the lower levels.
Sometimes you get that in motorbike racing. There was one example when Carl Fogarty, who was big in the 90s, fell off his bike, got back on and won the race.
So that's unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is unbelievable. But like in motorbike racing, you want to be thrown clear of that machine because one of the big ways to get terribly injured is that you get tangled up in your own bike.
Oh God, yeah.
You want to be thrown clear. And in the old days, they used to think that about racing cars. You don't want to wear a seatbelt because if hopefully, fingers crossed, you'll be thrown clear of it.
Yeah. I can see the logic.
Yeah, especially when they would quite often turn into a fireball as well. You don't want to be in that fireball if possible. But yeah, no crash helmets. I saw a bit of Sir Sterling Moss, the late great, truly great Sir Sterling Moss, told a story of when he told his father he wanted to become a professional race driver. And apparently his father said, we'd rather you don't, but if you do, you're going to wear a hard hat. And Sir Sterling Moss said, no, that's for sissies. I think that was the word he said. Now, all my heroes, Ascari and Fangio and all those guys, they wear cloth caps.
Cloth caps?
Cloth. You see them racing around in short-sleeved shirts and a cloth cap and some goggles.
Oh, I wonder what that was. It does make you wonder what's the point.
Yeah.
It's just a piece of cloth.
Yeah, there isn't a point. Yeah, it doesn't protect you whatsoever. And in fact, when they first started wearing sort of hard hats, they're sort of like a riding hat, not full face. So it gives you a little bit of protection.
Yeah.
I think they're like made out of cork.
Cork?
Yeah.
That's very strange.
Yeah, helmet designs only really started progressing properly in the sort of 60s. But anyway... it's so crazily dangerous in the pre-war years and after, of course, but in the pre-war years, there's some stories where people say, what one motoring journalist I heard say, he spoke to one of those guys back then in the late 40s, early 50s and says, you're aware it's ridiculously dangerous, right? And he was supposed to have said, yeah, but we're used to being shot at.
Yeah.
So the fact I'm not being shot at means that this is just a fun day out almost.
Carpe diem, no fear at all.
Right, yeah, I mean, talk about living every day to the mostest. And they would I've heard other people say that that sort of post-war racing was in some ways, especially international stuff like Formula One, it was in some small sense a continuation of the war when they put young men in these death machines.
Yeah, I can see that.
And you pit Britain and Italy and France against Germany and all this sort of stuff. And it's, in some very small way, it's a continuation of the war. Very, very limited sense. But yeah, you're putting these brave young men in death traps and say, go hell for leather and see what happens.
And naturally some would have been drawn to the idea of putting their lives on the line in pursuit of something greater than themselves, winning a driver's championship, or perhaps, almost collapsing your identity into the machinery that you've got to do the job is a way that could be compared to warfare in many ways.
Yeah, and it's competitive to the point of doing anything and everything.
Yeah.
It's sort of always been that way. One thing to say is obviously it's a European thing, largely, Formula One. We have had American constructors and even one, arguably two if you count Fittipaldi, American champions, but it's almost entirely European, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Britain, Germany, Italy, and France a bit are really the main the main players.
Yeah. I mean, forgive my ignorance. Was Haas the first American manufacturer to enter Formula One?
Don't think so.
Because Ford have never been in it, have they?
Well, Ford provided engines for many, many years. I don't think there was ever a Ford team.
But no, they provided engines to McLaren, didn't they?
Yeah, and other people. They provided engines for Tyrrell,
recently.
Lotus, Matra. There's a blast from the past.
God, yeah, it's very long
Matra,
ago.
late 60s, Brabham. Anyway, so in the early days, well, in 1946 was when the FIA was first brought into being, which is the Fédération Nationale de l'Automobile.
Yeah.
The FIA. So that's sort of the governing body, which is still the governing body to this day. So they sort of were brought into being in 1946, but it wasn't until 1950 when they sort of, the record books start. So let's start there. One of the most famous, one of the greatest drivers ever to have lived was Alberto Ascari. Oh, sorry. No, wait. Fangio, sorry.
Fangio.
Ascari is also among the best racers ever to have lived. There's the Ascari S's at Monza nowadays, aren't there? They're named after Ascari. He was great. I mean, he won a couple of the very first championships. But no, Fangio, Juan Manuel Fangio, who's an Argentine, won loads of them, and he's considered among the best ever, possibly the GOAT. I would make an argument he's the GOAT because, of course, in those days it was a lot more different. Nowadays, if you look at someone like Lewis Hamilton winning 6 championships on the trot, and he's got the best car, whereas Fangio won his 4 consecutive championships and 5 overall for 4 different manufacturers.
Wow.
And
he moved around then.
And they weren't, wherever he wasn't necessarily the most competitive one at the time.
Didn't he win one of those in an Alfa Romeo?
Yeah Alfa Romeo were, to begin with, the best team.
They were in it before Ferrari, weren't they?
Yeah.
So a lot of people forget that.
So the first season, 1950, Farina, Giuseppe Farina, another Italian, won it for Alfa Romeo. And Alfa Romeo won the next year with Fangio. So the biggest teams, the best teams at the beginning were all Italian, really. They were like Alfa Romeo, Ferrari, Maserati. The Italians were sort of the best manufacturers at the time. Fangio was actually, small side note, was kidnapped briefly by Fidel Castro.
Oh my! I never knew that. Bloody hell! What? Why?
Well, he wanted to try and influence him somehow. He was never going to kill him or anything like that. It was to Castro enjoyed racing, and I can't remember all the details about it, to be quite honest.
He wasn't just trying to sponsor the team to change that into like communist racing or something.
No. But yeah, he was a very interesting life, Fangio, and people look back on it, and of course, other people, Schumacher and Vettel and Hamilton have got better stats. If you just purely look at that, but that's not the whole story.
No, far from it.
I mean, for example, people talk about Ayrton Senna as the best ever. Again, his record isn't, it's not the best on paper. But people say on his day, when he was in the zone, nothing came close, especially in the wet. He was just a whole league better than everyone else. Say the same about all sorts of people in sport. Some people try and claim that Muhammad Ali was the best boxer ever. I mean, on paper, no. Especially at the end of his career, he got knocked out quite a few times. But people say on his day, in his youth, when he was at the top of his game, he was the best. No one's ever seen anything like it before or since. Anyway, the argument of who's the GOAT can go on and on and on, because it's impossible to measure.
It is.
It really is, because they keep changing, of course, the actual cars, but changing just the rules.
And Senna liked to bend those, as did Alain Prost, who I think actually doesn't get mentioned enough in that discussion, I would argue.
Yeah. We'll get onto the Senna Prost days when we get up to the 80s.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.